For 7 years, the boy lived in a world of absolute silence, and every doctor his Mafia kingpin father paid millions to said the same thing. There is no cure. But what the most dangerous man in the city didn't know was that the answer to his son's deafness wasn't hidden in a hospital. It was sitting right in front of him, held in the shaking hands of the woman he hired to clean his floors. Killian O'Shea ruled his criminal empire with an iron fist, but inside his fortress-like estate, he was a man drowning in a silence he couldn't break. His son, Zephyr, was his only heir, yet the boy had never heard his father's voice or the sound of his own name. The specialists called it a congenital nerve defect, an irreversible sentence that kept Killian writing blank checks for treatments that never worked. Guards with assault rifles stood like statues in the hallways, but no one, not the security, not the high-priced tutors, noticed the way Zephyr winced every time he touched his right ear. No one, until Sam arrived. Hired to scrub floors to pay off her father's gambling debts. Sam saw a boy who wasn't just deaf. He was in pain. While the experts saw a profitable tragedy, Sam saw a dark, glistening secret lodged deep inside the child's ear that was about to change the O'Shea dynasty forever. The O'Shea estate was a fortress of limestone and glass, perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the Atlantic. But to 7-year-old Zephyr, it was simply a graveyard of sounds he would never know. Inside the towering walls, silence wasn't just a condition, it was a law. Killian O'Shea, a man whose name was whispered in terror from the docks of Dublin to the high-rises of New York, sat at the head of a mahogany table that felt miles long. He was a king in a world of violence, a divorce titan who had cut his wife out of his life with the same surgical precision he used to eliminate rivals. But as he looked at his son, he felt the crushing weight of a battle he was losing. Killian's eyes, as cold and gray as the ocean outside, tracked the small boy sitting on the floor. Zephyr was meticulously lining up lead soldiers, his movements stiff and robotic. The boy didn't look up when a guard's heavy boots scuffed the floor. He didn't flinch when a thunderstorm rattled the massive panoramic windows. He existed in a vacuum, a silent prince whose inheritance was a kingdom he couldn't hear. To Killian, this was more than a medical failure. It was a personal insult from fate. He had spent millions, sums that could buy small nations, flying in specialists with titles that trailed off the page. They had come with their portable scanners, their silver needles, and their clinical arrogance. Each time, after hours of poking and prodding the boy, they would emerge from the private clinic wing with the same look of practiced sympathy. Congenital nerve death, Mr. O'Shea, they would say, their voices hushed as if the silence were contagious. The damage is deep. The silence is permanent. You must accept that your heir is meant to stay this way. Acceptance was a word Killian didn't recognize. He had built an empire by refusing to accept the limits others placed on him. Yet, as he watched Zephyr, he saw the boy's hand go to his right ear, a brief, frantic clawing motion accompanied by a wince that tightened his small jaw. Killian's brow furrowed. He'd mentioned this tic to the doctors, but they had dismissed it as a psychological manifestation of his frustration. They told him Zephyr was acting out the phantom sounds he could never grasp. Killian poured himself a double scotch, the amber liquid catching the light of the dying fire. The divorce had been bitter, a jagged tear in the fabric of his life, and he had convinced himself that Zephyr's silence was a parting gift of bad blood from a woman who had never understood the O'Shea legacy. He believed it was a genetic curse, a flaw in the lineage that no amount of blood money could wash away. The house was filled with people, yet felt hollow. Guards stood like gargoyles in the shadows, their hands resting on the grips of concealed weapons. Servants moved like ghosts, trained to be invisible and, above all, quiet. Mr. O'Shea liked the silence. It allowed him to hear the gears of his empire turning. But tonight, the silence felt heavy like a shroud. It smelled of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of unspoken grief. Every time Killian looked at his son, he saw a mirror of his own helplessness. He was a man who could order a hit on a senator, who could move tons of cargo across borders without a trace, but he couldn't give his son the one thing that cost nothing to a beggar on the street, the ability to hear his father say his name. Downstairs, in the servants' entrance, a different kind of desperation was arriving. Sam stood at the gate, her hands trembling as she clutched a small bag of belongings. The wind off the Atlantic whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She looked up at the O'Shea fortress, knowing that behind those walls lay the man who held her family's life in his blood-stained hands. Her father had been a fool, a man who thought he could outsmart the house, and now the debt had come due. Sam wasn't here for a career. She was here as a collateral payment. She was a maid, a nobody, a girl from the tenements hired to scrub the sins off the floors of a monster. As she was led through the labyrinthine hallways by a housekeeper who looked like she hadn't smiled since the Cold War, Sam felt the oppressive weight of the estate. It was too quiet. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum dedicated to a tragedy. Then she saw him. Through the cracked door of the library, she saw this silent heir. Zephyr was still on the floor, but he wasn't playing anymore. He was curled slightly, his head tilted, his fingers digging into the skin just below his ear. The housekeeper didn't stop, didn't even glance his way. To her, the boy was just another piece of expensive, broken furniture. But Sam stopped. Her heart, already bruised by her own family's chaos, felt a sharp pull. She had seen that look before, the specific, localized agony that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with something physical, something hidden. She saw the boy's eyes. They weren't vacant. They were terrified. They were the eyes of someone trapped inside a burning building with no way to scream for help. Killian looked up then, his gaze snapping to the door, catching the new Maid staring at his son. His eyes were predatory, warning her that in this house, looking too closely was a dangerous sin. Sam quickly lowered her head and moved on, but the image of the boy stayed burned into her mind. The doctors said he was born to be silent. The father believed he was cursed. But as Sam followed the housekeeper into the bowels of the mansion, she knew they were all wrong. The silence in the O'Shea house wasn't a tragedy of nature. It was a lie, and it was a lie that was slowly killing a child. She had come here to pay a debt, but as she gripped the handle of her cleaning bucket, she realized she might be the only person in the world who could hear the scream that Zephyr O'Shea couldn't make. The power in this house was vast, built on sound and fury, but the greatest secret was the one currently thriving in the deep, dark quiet of a little boy's ear. The staff quarters of the O'Shea estate were located in the north wing, a series of narrow, sterile rooms that felt more like a minimum security prison than a residence. Sam sat on the edge of her narrow cot, the springs groaning under her slight weight. The walls were painted a shade of beige that seemed designed to drain the soul, and the single window looked out onto the gray, churning Atlantic. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph of her father, his face gaunt and his eyes wide with the frantic terror of a man who had gambled away a life that wasn't his to lose. To the world, Killian O'Shea was a legend, a shadow king who pulled the strings of the city. To Sam, he was the man who held her father's debt, and this job was the only thing standing between her family and a shallow grave in the Irish countryside. The following morning, the reality of her new life set in with the ringing of a sharp bell at 5 a.m. Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, a woman with a face like etched granite and a voice that could cut through bone, met the new staff in the service kitchen. She stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes scanning the row of girls with predatory precision. "You are here to work," she began, her voice low and dangerous. "You are not here to be seen. You are not here to be heard. Most importantly, you are not here to engage with the master or his son." She paused, her gaze lingering on Sam. The boy, Zephyr, lives in a world of silence. Do not attempt to break it. Do not pity him. Do not touch him. If you so much as offer him a smile that isn't requested, you will be out the gate before your bags are packed. Sam nodded, her throat tight. She was handed a heavy galvanized bucket, a roll of flannel cloths, and a list of chores that seemed physically impossible for one person to complete in a day. As she began her rounds, the sheer scale of the O'Shea mansion became apparent. It was a labyrinth of marble, velvet, and dark wood, every surface polished to a mirror finish. Yet, despite the luxury, There was an unmistakable rot of the spirit within the walls. The other maids moved like clockwork dolls, their eyes fixed on the floor, their mouths set in thin, grim lines. There was no chatter, no humming, no shared jokes over tea. The silence of the air had infected the entire household. By mid-morning, Sam found herself assigned to the sunroom, a vast glass-walled chamber filled with exotic plants that looked like they were struggling to breathe in the salt air. In the center of the room, seated on a low rug, was Zephyr. He was surrounded by intricate model airplanes, his small hands working with a precision that was unnerving for a child his age. He didn't look up when Sam entered. He didn't react to the sound of her bucket hitting the tiled floor or the rhythmic slosh of the water. Sam began to scrub the baseboards, her movements slow and deliberate. She watched him out of the corner of her eye. From a distance, he looked like a doll, but up close, she saw the tension in his neck. She saw the way his jaw muscles rippled as he ground his teeth. And then, she saw it again, the gesture that had haunted her since she arrived. Zephyr reached up with his right hand, his fingers curling into a claw, and he pressed the heel of his palm into his ear with such force that the skin turned white. A small, sharp wince crossed his face, a flicker of pure agony that he quickly suppressed, as if he were used to the pain being his only constant companion. He's just a broken toy, girl. Don't waste your breath. Sam jumped, nearly knocking over her bucket. Mrs. Gable was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. Her eyes were fixed on Zephyr with a look that was almost like resentment. "I wasn't saying anything, ma'am," Sam whispered, dropping her gaze. "Good," Gable snapped. "The specialists say his condition is congenital. Nerve death from the womb. Mr. O'Shea has spent millions trying to buy a set of ears for that boy, but you can't fix what God decided to leave out." She stepped into the room, her heels clicking like gunshots on the tile. Zephyr didn't even flinch at the sound. He's a reminder of a marriage that failed and a mother who didn't want to stay. Mr. O'Shea provides for him, but he doesn't need your sentimentality. Finish the floors and move to the library. As Mrs. Gable swept out, Sam felt a surge of cold fury. She looked back at Zephyr. He had picked up a small plastic wing and was trying to snap it into place, but his hands are shaking. The nerve death the doctor spoke of didn't explain the inflammation she could see behind his earlobe. It didn't explain the way his eyes darted toward the window, as if he were waiting for a sound that never came. Sam moved her bucket closer to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew the rules. She knew the stakes. One wrong move, and her father would pay the price. But she also remembered her own mother's voice, a woman who had been a nurse in the poorest wards of the city, telling her that the loudest screams are often the ones that never leave the throat. She reached out, her hand hovering inches from Zephyr's shoulder. She wanted to tell him she saw him. She wanted to tell him that he wasn't a broken toy. But the shadow of a guard passed by the glass door, and Sam quickly withdrew. She plunged her cloth into the soapy water and began to scrub with a ferocity that made her knuckles bleed. The boy remained in his silent bubble, a prince in a glass cage, unaware that the newest nobody in his father's house was starting to look at him not with pity, but with the terrifying clarity of a hunter who had found a hidden truth. Sam realized then that the O'Shea mansion wasn't just silent because the boy was deaf. It was silent because it was a house built on secrets, and the specialists, the guards, and even the father were all players in a game where the boy was the only one losing. As the sun began to set over the Atlantic, casting long, blood-red shadows across the sunroom floor, Sam made a silent vow to herself. She would keep her head down, she would scrub the floors, and she would pay her father's debt. But she would also keep watching the boy's ear. Because she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that the doctors hadn't just failed Zephyr, they were lying to him. The third week at the O'Shea estate brought a shift in the atmosphere, one that Sam felt in the marrow of her bones. A cold front had moved in off the Atlantic, turning the limestone walls of the mansion into blocks of ice that seemed to radiate a psychic chill. In this house, silence was more than the absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that muffled even the sound of one's own heartbeat. Sam had settled into a rhythm of invisibility, her hands perpetually raw from the caustic cleaning agents she used to scrub the marble. but her mind was far from quiet. Every time she passed the library or the sunroom, her eyes sought out Zephyr. She began to notice the patterns of his pain. It wasn't constant, but it was predictable. It flared when the barometric pressure dropped, or when he tried to concentrate too hard on the models. She watched him from the shadows of the hallways, seeing the way he would suddenly freeze, his eyes clouding over as he pressed his head against the cold glass of a window. The specialist had called it a behavioral tic, a symptom of his frustration with a world he couldn't hear. Sam knew better. She had seen the way his skin flushed red around the base of his ear, a subtle inflammation that the high-priced doctors, in their rush to confirm a congenital diagnosis, had simply ignored. One Tuesday evening, the house was particularly tense. Killian was hosting a meeting in the lower study, a sit-down that brought men in dark overcoats and silent cars to the estate. The guards were on high alert, their presence doubling in the corridors. Sam was tasked with cleaning the upstairs gallery, a long stretch of hallway filled with portraits of O'Shea ancestors who all shared Killian's predatory, unforgiving eyes. As she worked the beeswax into the dark oak paneling, she heard a soft, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from Zephyr's bedroom. Against every instruction she had been given by Mrs. Gable, Sam dropped her cloth and moved toward the door. It was slightly ajar. Inside, the room was a masterpiece of clinical luxury. Soft gray carpets, custom-built shelves filled with untouched books, and a bed that looked too large for the small boy sitting on the floor. Zephyr was rocking back and forth, his forehead hitting the side of his bed frame with a dull, sickening thud. His eyes were clamped shut, and his hands were clamped over his right ear, so hard his knuckles were ghostly white. There were no tears, just a silent, vibrating agony that filled the room. Sam's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked back at the empty hallway, the shadows of the guards dancing on the far wall. She knew the rules. If she entered this room, she was violating the sanctity of the heir's treatment. She could be fired, or worse, given the nature of Killian's business. But then Zephyr let out a sharp, ragged breath, a sound that wasn't quite a cry, but carried more pain than any scream she'd ever heard. She stepped inside. "Zephyr," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her. The boy didn't react. He hit his head against the bed again. Sam knelt beside him, her shadow falling across his lap. He froze. Slowly, his eyes opened, unfocused and bloodshot. When he saw her, he didn't recoil. He simply stared, his small face twisted into a mask of suffering. Sam didn't touch him. Instead, she slowly reached out her hand and made a gesture she had learned from her mother. A circular motion over her own heart, followed by a flat palm pressed against the air. It was a universal sign for, "I am here. I see you." Zephyr watched her fingers move. For a fleeting second, the tension in his jaw slackened. He looked at her hand, then up at her face. Sam slowly raised her hand toward his ear. She didn't touch him yet. She waited for his permission. The boy hesitated, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, with a slow, trembling motion, he leaned his head toward her. Sam's fingers grazed the skin behind his ear. It was burning hot. She gently tilted his head toward the bedside lamp. The specialist had looked at his nerves, his brain waves, his genetics. But they hadn't looked at the anatomy. Sam saw it then, a slight, unnatural bulge deep within the canal, obscured by a fold of skin that appeared slightly distorted. It wasn't a malformation. It looked like an obstruction that had become part of the tissue over years of neglect. Before she could investigate further, the heavy click of heels echoed in the hallway. Sam scrambled back, grabbing a stray toy car from the floor just as Mrs. Gable appeared in the doorway. The woman's face was a mask of cold fury. "What are you doing in here?" Gable's voice was a low hiss. The door was open, ma'am," Sam stammered, holding up the toy. "I saw him drop this earlier. I was just returning it." Gable stepped into the room, her eyes darting between Sam and the boy. Zephyr had returned to his rigid, silent state, staring blankly at the wall. "You were told to stay away from him. He is under a strict medical protocol. Your kindness is a disruption he cannot afford." "He's in pain, Mrs. Gable," Sam said, her voice bolder than she intended. "His ear is hot to the touch." He was hitting his head. Gable's eyes narrowed until they were mere slits. He's a child with a profound disability. His pain is a matter for Dr. Eris and the specialists, not for a girl who scrubs toilets. If I catch you in this wing again, you won't just be fired. I will ensure your father's debt is settled in other ways. The threat was clear. Sam felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. She backed out of the room, her head bowed, but as she passed Gable, she caught a glimpse of the woman's expression. It wasn't just anger. It was a flicker of something else. Suspicion. Or perhaps fear that someone was looking too closely. Sam spent the rest of the night in her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the medical protocol Gable had mentioned. She thought about the millions Killian was spending. And she thought about the heat radiating from that little boy's ear. She realized then that the rule of silence wasn't just about Zephyr's hearing. It was a boundary meant to keep the truth from leaking out. The doctors were the high priests of this silence, and Killian was its financier. But Sam had seen the darkness in the canal. She didn't have a degree, and she didn't have power, but she had something the specialists lacked. She wasn't being paid to stay blind. As the wind howled against the limestone walls, Sam made a choice. She would find a way to look again. She would find a way to prove that the silent heir was actually a boy being buried alive by his own cure. The stakes were no longer just her father's life. They were the soul of a child who had trusted her enough to lean his head into her hand. The following week, the atmosphere in the O'Shea mansion shifted from a cold silence to a pressurized one. Killian was increasingly absent, caught in the middle of a territorial dispute at the docks that required his brutal brand of diplomacy. In his absence, the house felt even more like a tomb, with Mrs. Gable and the high-priced doctor, a man named Dr. Eris, tightening their grip on the daily routine. Dr. Eris was a man of silver hair and eyes that held the cold, calculating sheen of a microscope lens. Every time he visited Zephyr, he walked past the cleaning staff as if they were nothing more than the dust they were hired to remove. Sam continued her quiet observations, her mind racing with the image of the obstruction she had glimpsed. She started spending her meager breaks in the mansion's vast library when she was assigned to dust the high shelves, searching for old medical texts among the leather-bound classics. She needed to understand what she had seen. Her mother's old stories of swimmer's ear or impacted debris didn't seem to fit the severity of Zephyr's condition, but the heat radiating from the boy's ear suggested a chronic, localized infection, one that a simple MRI should have caught. Unless, of course, the scans were being faked. One afternoon, Sam was polishing the silver in the dining room when she saw Zephyr in the garden through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was sitting on a stone bench, his sketchbook open on his lap, but he wasn't drawing. He was staring at a fountain, his hand once again creeping up to his ear. The wince that crossed his face was so sharp he actually doubled over, his sketchbook sliding to the grass. Without thinking, Sam dropped her polishing cloth and slipped out the side door. The air outside was biting, smelling of salt and incoming rain. She reached the bench just as Zephyr looked up. His eyes were glassy with pain, and for the first time, she saw a tear track through the dirt on his cheek. "I know," Sam whispered, kneeling on the grass before him. "I know it hurts, Zephyr." She didn't have her mother's medical kit, but she had a small, powerful flashlight she'd taken from the supply closet. She reached out, and this time, Zephyr didn't hesitate. He leaned into her touch like a drowning man reaching for a life raft. Sam gently pulled back the top of his ear, clicking on the light. The inflammation was worse. The skin of the canal was angry and purple, and deep inside, the dark mass she had seen before seemed to have shifted. It wasn't organic. As the light hit it, there was a tiny, unmistakable glint, the reflection of something metallic or glass-like buried under layers of wax and scar tissue. Her breath hitched. This wasn't a biological defect. This was an object. Thump. The voice boomed across the garden. Sam jumped, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. Killian was standing on the terrace, his coat fluttering in the wind. Beside him stood Dr. Eris, his face pale and his lips pulled back in a snarl. Killian descended the stairs with a predatory grace that made Sam's legs turn to lead. "I believe there was a very specific instruction regarding my son," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He reached them, his shadow looming over Sam. He looked down at the flashlight in her hand, then at his son, who was trembling. "He's in pain, sir," Sam said, her voice shaking but steady. I saw him collapse." Dr. Harris stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mr. O'Shea, this is exactly what I warned you about. Unqualified staff interfering with a delicate neurological case. The boy has sensory processing issues. Physical touch from strangers causes him immense psychological distress, which he manifests as pain. She's making it worse." Killian's gray eyes narrowed as he looked at Sam. "Is that what you were doing? Making it worse?" "No," Sam said, looking Killian directly in the eye, a move that usually resulted in a backhand from a man of his stature. "I saw something. In his ear. It's not a nerve problem, Mr. O'Shea. There's something inside his head that shouldn't be there." Dr. Harris let out a short, mocking laugh. "A Maid's diagnosis against 3 years of CAT scans and specialist reviews? Killian, surely you see the absurdity." Killian looked at his son. Zephyr was looking at Sam with a desperate, silent plea. The Mafia boss reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering near Zephyr's face. The boy flinched, not out of fear of his father, but out of the sheer agony of the movement. Killian's expression hardened. "Get back to your quarters," Killian commanded Sam. "If I see you near him again, the debt your father owes will be the least of your worries." Sam backed away, her heart sinking. As she walked toward the servant's entrance, she looked back. Dr. Harris was placing a hand on Zephyr's shoulder, leaden and cold, while Killian stood staring at the ocean, his jaw set in a line of pure iron. That night, Sam sat in the dark, her mind on fire. She realized that Dr. Harris wasn't just arrogant, he was terrified. The way he had rushed to dismiss her, the way he had manipulated Killian's guilt, it was the behavior of a man guarding a gold mine. She thought about the treatments Zephyr received every Thursday, the injections that left him lethargic and silent for days. She realized then that Killian O'Shea, the most feared man in the city, was being played. And Zephyr was the pawn. The silent heir was a gold mine for Eris and whoever else was on the payroll. If Zephyr could hear, the millions in research grants, the private clinic fees, and the control they had over the boss would vanish. Sam looked at her hands. They were the hands of a maid, stained with bleach and calloused from work. But they were also the only hands that weren't reaching for Killian's pockets. She knew she couldn't wait for Killian to see the truth. The infection in Zephyr's ear was reaching a breaking point. If the object wasn't removed soon, the permanent deafness the doctors promised would become a reality. Or worse, the infection would reach his brain. The plan formed in her mind, desperate and dangerous. She didn't need a medical degree. She needed an opportunity, a pair of sterilized tools, and the courage to face a Mafia boss's wrath. She would give Zephyr his voice back, or she would die trying. The secret bond between the maid and the silent heir grew in the quietest hours of the night. Sam knew that every movement she made was being tracked by the cameras and the cold eyes of the guards, so she turned their surveillance into a game of shadows. To anyone watching the monitors, she was merely a diligent servant, obsessively dusting the same mahogany shelves in the library. In reality, she was teaching Zephyr a language the O'Shea Empire couldn't crack. She began with small things, tactile symbols pressed into the palm of his hand. A circle for wait, a double tap for danger, and a gentle squeeze for friend. Zephyr, hungry for any form of true connection that didn't involve a needle or a cold stethoscope, learned with a speed that was breathtaking. He wasn't the slow, damaged child the specialist described. He was a brilliant mind trapped behind a wall of manufactured silence. One evening, while Killian was embroiled in a tense meeting downstairs, Sam sat on the floor of the library with Zephyr. She had brought a stack of colored paper she'd scavenged from the recycling bin. With quick, deft folds, she created a small paper bird. She held it up, and then, moving his hand to his throat, she mimicked the vibration of a song. Zephyr's eyes widened. He touched the paper wings, then touched Sam's throat, his face a mask of intense concentration. He was trying to understand the concept of sound through the only medium he had left, vibration and touch. Sam realized then that his deafness was a physical barrier, not a mental one. The more they communicated, the more she noticed the physical symptoms of his ailment. The right side of his face had a slight, almost imperceptible droop, and his balance was increasingly off. The object she had glimpsed was putting pressure on his facial nerves. "We have to be careful," she signed into his palm, her heart racing as she heard the heavy tread of boots in the hallway. Zephyr nodded, his small face grave. He quickly hid the paper bird inside a hollowed-out book on a lower shelf. As the door swung open, Sam was already on her knees, vigorously polishing the brass fireplace set. A guard lingered in the doorway, his hand resting on his belt, his eyes scanning the room with bored suspicion. He saw nothing but a maid and a quiet boy, and he moved on. Later that night, Sam found herself alone in the kitchen, scrubbing the industrial-sized pots. The back door creaked open, and a man she recognized as one of the junior guards, a boy named Finn who hadn't yet lost the kindness in his eyes, walked in. "You're working late, Sam," he said, reaching for a glass of water. "The work never ends in a house this big, Finn," she replied, not looking up. Finn leaned against the counter, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Be careful with the boy. I saw you in the garden with him. Mrs. Gable was talking to Dr. Harris about you. They don't like people getting too close. They say it disrupts the treatment plan." Sam stopped scrubbing. "Finn, have you ever noticed anything strange about Dr. Harris? About the way he treats Zephyr?" Finn looked toward the door, his expression nervous. "I'm just a guard, Sam. I get paid to watch the perimeter, not the doctor. But I'll tell you this. Every time that doctor leaves the boys' room after a treatment, Zephyr looks like he's been through a war. And Harris? He leaves looking like he just won the lottery." The confirmation chilled Sam to the bone. It wasn't just neglect, it was active sabotage. As Finn left, Sam realized her time was running out. She had been watching the calendar. Every Thursday, Eris performed a nerve stimulation procedure. Tomorrow was Thursday. She retreated to her room and pulled a small, stolen medical kit from beneath her floorboard. She had gathered a pair of fine-tipped tweezers from the vanity, high-grade antiseptic from the first aid station, and a small, powerful magnifying glass. It was a crude set of tools for a surgery that required a miracle, but she was the only surgeon Zephyr had. She spent the night practicing her grip, her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to swallow her. She thought about Killian, the man who ruled the city but was a prisoner to his own grief. He wasn't an evil man, she realized. He was a blinded one. He had been told his son was broken, and he had believed it because the lie was wrapped in the authority of science and the weight of his own guilt over the divorce. As the first light of dawn touched the Atlantic, Sam hid her tools in the lining of her apron. Today was the day she would either give Zephyr's voice back, or she would lose everything she had left. She knew the sit-down scheduled for that afternoon would draw Killian and the bulk of the security away to the docks. It was the only window she would ever have. The silent prince was waiting for his voice, and Sam was ready to scream for him. The weight of the impending cliff was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical pressure in Sam's chest that made every breath feel like inhaling broken glass. Thursday arrived with the sky the color of a bruised lung, the Atlantic churning violently against the cliffs below the O'Shea estate. This was the day of the great sit-down at the docks, an event that had drained the mansion of its primary defenses. Killian had departed at noon in a 3-car convoy, leaving behind only a skeleton crew of guards and the oppressive authority of Mrs. Gable. Sam spent the morning in a state of hypervigilance, her fingers tracing the sharp edges of the tweezers hidden in her apron. She knew that Dr. Harris was due at 3 o'clock for Zephyr's weekly nerve treatment. In her mind, the pieces of the puzzle had finally locked into place. The injections weren't medicine. They were sedatives designed to keep the boy compliant and dull the localized agony of the infection. If she was going to act, it had to be now, before Eris arrived to bury the truth under another layer of chemical fog. She found Zephyr in the library, though he wasn't playing. He was slumped against the mahogany wainscoting, his face pale and clammy. The infection had clearly breached a new threshold. His right eye was squinted shut, and a thin, yellowish discharge had begun to seep from the canal, staining the collar of his expensive silk shirt. The boy was trembling so violently that the book in his lap rattled against his knees. When he saw Sam, his expression wasn't one of hope, but of pure, terminal exhaustion. He was giving up. Sam knelt before him, her heart thundering. "Zephyr, look at me," she signed, her hands shaking so much the gestures were nearly unintelligible. "I'm going to help you. I'm going to take the pain away." The boy's eyes searched hers. He saw the terror she was trying to hide, but he also saw the resolve. Slowly, painfully, he nodded. He leaned his head back against the wood, exposing the inflamed side of his face. Sam reached for her tools, but her hand froze as the heavy library doors creaked open. It was Mrs. Gable. The woman stood there, her silhouette long and jagged against the hallway light. She didn't speak at first, her eyes tracking the way Sam was positioned over the air. "I told you to stay away from him, Sam," Gable said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Dr. Harris will be here in 20 minutes. He specifically requested that the boy be uncontaminated by staff before the procedure." "He's dying, Mrs. Gable," Sam said, her voice cracking. "Look at him. This isn't a nerve defect. He's septic. If you let Harris give him another sedative, he might not wake up." Gable stepped into the room, her face a mask of iron. "You are a maid. You are debt repayment. You're not a doctor. Move away from the child, or I will call the guards to remove you by force." Sam looked at Zephyr, then back at Gable. She realized then that Gable wasn't just following orders. She was a gatekeeper. If the truth came out, Gable's position of power in the household would vanish along with the doctor's. Sam stood up, but she didn't move away. She stepped between Gable and the boy. "I know why you're doing this," Sam whispered. "I know about the money. I know about the lies. When Killian finds out you let his son rot from the inside out just to keep your pockets full, there won't be a corner of this world where you can hide." For the first time, Gable's mask slipped. A flicker of genuine panic crossed her eyes, quickly replaced by a cold, murderous intent. She reached for the radio on her belt, but the sound of a distant car horn, Eris's arrival, distracted her for a split second. "Get out," Gable hissed. "Now!" Sam backed away, but she didn't go to her room. She sprinted toward the service stairs, her mind racing. She had minutes. The extraction was no longer a choice. It was a race. She knew Eris would take Zephyr to the private clinic wing, a sterile, locked-down area where she would never be able to reach him. She had to intercept him. She had to find a moment where the doctor's guard was down. She hid in the shadows of the clinic's anteroom, watching through the frosted glass as Eris entered with his leather bag. She saw Gable whispering to him, pointing back toward the library. Eris looked annoyed, his mouth set in a tight line. He signaled for the guards to stay at the door while he entered the treatment room with Zephyr. This was it. The way to the cliff was crumbling beneath her feet. One way or another, the silence of the O'Shea house was about to be shattered. Sam gripped the tweezers so hard the metal bit into her palm, and she waited for the sound of the doctor's heavy footsteps to recede into the inner chamber. She was going in. The clinic wing was a sterile sanctuary of white tile and humming machinery, but to Sam, it felt like the belly of a beast. She waited until the guard at the door were distracted by a radio call, likely a report from the docks, and slipped through the side maintenance hatch. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in her ribs, each beat a deafening thud in the unnatural quiet of the medical wing. Through the observation window of the inner suite, she saw Dr. Harris preparing a syringe, the liquid inside a pale, sickly amber. Zephyr lay on the table, his small body rigid, his eyes fixed on the ceiling in a stare of pure, hollowed-out terror. "This will help with the phantom pain, Zephyr," Harris said, his voice smooth and oily, the sound of a man who had long ago traded his soul for a steady stream of O'Shea's black market millions. Sam didn't wait for the needle to break the skin. She kicked the door open, the heavy wood slamming against the wall with a crack like a gunshot. Harris spun around, his face contorting into a mask of indignant rage, but Sam was already across the room. She grabbed a heavy tray of surgical instruments and shoved it between them, the metal clattering to the floor. "Get away from him," she screamed, a sound that finally broke the 7-year silence of the O'Shea household. "You've lost your mind," Eris hissed, reaching for the wall alarm. "Guards! The guards are at the gate, and Killian is at the docks." Sam retorted, though she knew it was a lie. The guards were just outside. She lunged forward, grabbing the doctor's arm. In the struggle, the syringe fell, shattering against the tile. "I saw it, Eris. I saw the glint. You didn't miss it. You put it there, or you kept it there. You've been letting an infection rot his brain for profit." Zephyr let out a strangled, silent gasp, his hand flying to his ear. The pressure of the infection was reaching a critical mass. The boy's face was beginning to swell, the skin tight and shiny. Sam realized she had seconds before the guards burst in or the boy went into a permanent convulsion. She shoved the doctor back with a desperate, adrenaline-fueled strength, sending him sprawling into a rack of glass vials. She turned to Zephyr. "Trust me," she signed, her hands flying. "Stay still. Please stay still." With the steady hands of a woman who had nothing left to lose, Sam pulled the silver tweezers from her apron. She clicked on the high-intensity surgical lamp, swinging it over Zephyr's head. The light revealed the horror in stark detail. The ear canal was nearly closed, but deep inside, wedged against the tympanic membrane, was the dark, jagged edge of a foreign object, a piece of industrial glass, likely from an accident years ago, that had been allowed to become encased in scar tissue and filth. Outside, she heard the heavy boots of the guards hitting the floor. "Open the door," a voice bellowed. Sam ignored them. She braced her hip against the table and positioned the tweezers. Her vision narrowed until the only thing in the world was that dark, poisonous sliver. She felt the vibration of the guards throwing their weight against the locked door. One chance. She dived in. The tweezers gripped the edge of the mass. Zephyr's body arched off the table, his mouth opening in a silent scream of agony. Sam felt the resistance of years of scar tissue, then a sickening pop. As she pulled the tweezers back, a dark, dense mass of calcified glass and black fluid erupted from the ear. It hit the floor with a wet thud just as the door splintered open. The room was suddenly flooded with guards, their weapons drawn. Killian O'Shea stood in the center of the wreckage, his face a mask of cold, murderous fury. He had returned early. He saw his son bleeding on the table, and he saw Sam holding the blood-stained tweezers. "Kill her," Killian whispered, his voice the sound of a closing grave. But the world didn't end in gunfire. It ended in a sound. From the table, a sharp, ragged gasp tore through the room. Zephyr sat up, his eyes wide, his hands trembling as they touched the air around him. He turned his head toward the heavy grandfather clock in the corner, his face twisting in confusion as the rhythmic tick-tock reached his brain for the first time in 7 years. The guards froze. Killian's gun hand wavered. Zephyr looked at the man he had only ever known as a silent shadow. His lips moved, testing the weight of a vibration he finally understood. Dada. The word was small, rough, and cracked like a dry riverbed, but it hit Killian O'Shea harder than any bullet ever could. The Mafia boss dropped his weapon, his knees hitting the sterile floor as the silence of his empire finally, mercifully, shattered. The silence that followed Zephyr's first word was not the oppressive, heavy vacuum that had ruled the O'Shea estate for years. It was a fragile, crystalline stillness, broken only by the sound of Killian's ragged breathing. The guards stood like statues, their weapons lowered, their eyes darting between the blood-stained Maid and the boss who was currently crumbling on the floor. Killian reached out a hand, his fingers trembling as they grazed Zephyr's cheek. "You can hear me?" Killian's voice was a ghost of its usual gravelly command. Zephyr flinched slightly at the volume, his eyes wide and darting toward every source of new input. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant crash of the waves, the jingle of a guard's keys. He nodded slowly, a tear finally breaking free and tracking through the blood on his neck. "Dada," he repeated, the sound more confident this time, though the D was soft and unpracticed. The moment was shattered by a desperate, lunging movement from the corner. Dr. Eris, his face purple with a mix of fear and indignation, scrambled to his feet. Killian, listen to me. This is a fluke, a traumatic response. The girl has caused permanent damage to the ear canal. That sound he made, it's just air escaping the lungs. It's not speech. Killian didn't look at the doctor. He didn't even look at Sam. He kept his eyes locked on his son. He said my name, Eris. He said my name, and he looked at the clock before it even chimed. A coincidence, Eris shouted, his voice rising in a pitch that betrayed his panic. I'm the foremost expert in this field. You're going to trust a debt-ridden Maid over a decade of clinical research? She used unsterilized tools. The infection will turn into meningitis within the hour. Killian slowly stood up. The transformation was terrifying. The weeping father vanished, replaced by the Shadow King of the Irish underworld. He turned toward Eris, his eyes two cold, gray stones. Finn, Killian said, not breaking eye contact with the doctor. The young guard who had befriended Sam stepped forward. Sir, take the boy and Sam to my private car. Drive to the Mercy General, not our clinic. The real hospital. Call the chief of surgery. Tell him if my son isn't seen in 5 minutes, I'll burn the city down with him inside it. What about the doctor, sir? Finn asked, his hand hovering over his holster. Killian's gaze didn't waver. The doctor and I are going to have a talk about clinical research. And someone find Mrs. Gable. I want to know exactly how much she was paid to keep my son in a tomb. Sam felt Finn's hand on her arm, pulling her toward the door. She was covered in Zephyr's blood and the black fluid of the infection. Her legs felt like they were made of water, but she didn't let go of Zephyr's hand. As they were ushered out of the clinic wing, she heard the heavy thud of the door locking behind them, followed by a sound she would never forget. The sound of Killian O'Shea finally letting his rage find his target. The drive to the hospital was a blur of neon lights and the rhythmic wail of the siren. Zephyr sat pressed against Sam's side, his hands over his ears, overwhelmed by the sensory explosion of the city. Every car horn, every screech of tires made him jump, but he wouldn't let go of Sam's apron. He watched her lips as she whispered to him, not with signs, but with sounds. It's okay, she murmured, the vibrations of her voice traveling through his shoulder. That's a car. That's the wind. It's okay. At the hospital, the chaos was controlled. The chief of surgery was waiting at the ambulance bay, flanked by a team that looked significantly more competent and more nervous than Eris's team. They whisked Zephyr onto a gurney, but as they wheeled him away, the boy reached out, his fingers catching Sam's. Stay, he croaked. I'm not going anywhere, Sam promised, her voice thick with emotion. For 4 hours, Sam sat in the sterile waiting room, her father's debt and her own safety the furthest things from her mind. She watched the news on a wall-mounted TV, silent, as if in irony, until a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Killian. His suit was torn, and there was a dark bruise forming on his jaw, but his eyes were clear. He sat down in the plastic chair next to her, a man who owned half the city looking small in the fluorescent light. The surgeons just finished, Killian said. They removed the rest of the debris. It was a shard of reinforced safety glass, Sam, from the car accident 7 years ago, the one that killed his mother. Sam gasped. The specialists, they said it was congenital. They lied, Killian said, his voice a flat, dangerous line. Eris found the shard 3 years ago during a routine scan. He realized that if he removed it, the gravy train stopped. He approached Gable. They've been splitting the research funds ever since. They kept him sedated so he wouldn't complain about the pain. They were banking on the infection eventually killing the nerves so the lie would become a permanent truth. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, Sam saw the man behind the monster. I spent 8 years looking for a miracle in the most expensive places on earth. I hired the best, the brightest, the most qualified. He looked at Sam's raw, stained hands. And all the while, the only person who actually bothered to listen to my son was the girl I hired to scrub my floors. I just saw a little boy who was hurting Mr. O'Shea, Sam said quietly. No, Killian corrected her. You saw him. No one else did. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger, the record of her father's debts. Without a word, he tore the pages out, crumpled them, and dropped them into the trash can. Your father's debt is gone, but mine to you is just beginning. The O'Shea estate was no longer a fortress of oppressive quiet. It had become a house of echoes and learning. 2 months had passed since the night the silent prince had reclaimed his voice, and the limestone walls now rang with the sounds of a child discovering the world. Zephyr was no longer curled in the corners of libraries or sunrooms. He was outside, shouting at the gulls, asking the name of every flower, and laughing at the way the Atlantic spray hissed against the rocks. Sam sat on the terrace, watching Zephyr run through the garden with a pair of high-tech hearing aids, a temporary measure as his ear canal continued to heal. She was no longer wearing the gray maid's uniform. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant dress. Her role transitioned from domestic servant to Zephyr's primary guardian and the manager of the estate staff. Her father was safe, his debts cleared, and his life relocated to a quiet cottage on the other side of the country, far from the reach of the syndicates. Killian joined her on the terrace, a cup of coffee in his hand. The hard lines of his face hadn't entirely vanished. A man like him would always carry the weight of his empire, but the predatory coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a weary, profound peace. He watched his son with a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. He doesn't stop talking, Killian said, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The tutors say he's already catching up to his grade level. They call him a linguistic sponge. He was always there, Killian, Sam said softly. He was just waiting for someone to open the door. The fallout from the betrayal had been swift and absolute. Dr. Eris and Mrs. Gable had disappeared into the dark machinery of Killian's justice. No one in the city expected to see them again. The medical inner circle had been purged, replaced by a team of independent physicians who were held to a standard of transparency that was enforced by Killian's personal oversight. The O'Shea organization was still a shadow power, but its heart had shifted. Killian had begun pouring his vast resources into a foundation for children with sensory disabilities, ensuring that no other father would be blinded by the profitable tragedy of a crooked specialist. Zephyr spotted them on the terrace and came sprinting up the stone steps. He skidded to a halt in front of Sam, holding a seashell to his ear. "Sam, listen," he cried, his voice now bright and clear. He pressed the shell against her ear. "It sounds like the wind. Why does it do that?" Sam smiled, pulling him into a side hug. "It's the sound of the air moving inside the shell, Zephyr. It's always been there. You just had to be ready to hear it." Zephyr looked at his father, then back at Sam. He reached out and took both of their hands, linking them together. For a moment, the three of them stood in a circle of reclaimed life. This silent air was silent no more, and the Mafia boss who had once ruled through fear had learned that the most powerful thing he owned wasn't his empire, but the sound of his son's laughter. "Thank you, Sam," Zephyr whispered, leaning his head against her arm. "No," Killian said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at the woman who had risked everything to save his bloodline. "Thank you, Sam, for teaching us that even in a world of shadows, the truth always has a voice." As the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, the O'Shea mansion was finally a home. The darkness had been pulled out, the lies had been silenced, and for the first time in 7 years, the only thing filling the air was the beautiful, chaotic noise of a future being written. The maid had changed everything, not with a weapon or wealth, but with the simple, courageous act of paying attention. "I've spent 7 years trying to buy a miracle, and it turned out the only thing my son needed was someone who truly cared." If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and tell me in the comments. Have you ever seen a small person uncover a massive truth? I'm reading all your stories from around the world.